Welcome to the Endpoints podcast, presented by the ALS Therapy Development Institute. I'm Jonathan Gang. When we talk about ALS, we often make a distinction between two types of the disease. 90% of cases appear to be sporadic, meaning that there is no family history of ALS. The opposite is true of the other 10%, known as familial or genetic ALS. In these cases, the disease can sometimes be traced back in a family for generations. Behind this phenomenon are a number of inherited mutations in genes with names like SOD1, FUS, and C9orf72. With the advent of widely available genetic testing, people with a family history of ALS are now able to find out if they carry these mutations, and are thus likely to develop the disease. When Jean Swidler was a child, she lost her grandmother to ALS. Then, as an adult, her mother was diagnosed with the disease. Finally, Jean herself underwent genetic testing and discovered that she carries the C9orf72 repeat expansion mutation. Since then, Jean has become a tireless advocate for asymptomatic carriers of ALS-related genetic mutations. Today, she joins us to talk about her story, her advocacy, and how she believes the medical and research establishment could be better serving people in her situation.
My mother, following my grandmother's death, so I didn't, that's all I knew. So my grandmother had ALS. After that, my mother started talking about being anxious about getting ALS or thinking she had ALS for a long, or like being worried that she had it for a long time. And she would talk about it all the time, and no one would engage with her about it. To me, like I think certainly my dad and my siblings, just thought it was like kind of this neurotic, unfounded fear, borne out by a parent having a terrible disease. And her siblings, who knew the same thing she knew, also didn't really engage with her about it. So this went on for a long time. Like I remember we got married in 2016, me and my husband, and we were having dinner with my parents and his parents, and it came up in that dinner conversation. She was just always talking about it. Also in that wedding, in our wedding, my mom had trouble walking down the stairs to the ceremony because we were on a dock and there were stairs down to the dock, and she had trouble with that. And she stepped on my dress as we were walking to the altar because she was having a little trouble lifting her legs. But she thought it was arthritis. She was in her late 60s by this point, so she thought this was arthritis.
Jean's mother's symptoms continued to get worse, but despite her family history of ALS, she struggled to convince her doctors, and even her family, of what she was sure of, that these could be the early signs of the same disease that killed her own mother.
All this time she's saying, I have ALS, to everyone. And what are we as her family telling her? What are we saying to her? We are telling her, Mom, the doctor said you don't have ALS. Why are you being neurotic? Why are you being so negative? ALS is terminal condition. They said you're not dying. And so she continued to have to be alone in that fear while she was doing all of this. So I can't imagine the mental anguish that was, knowing that she had this terminal disease, no one believing her, probably some guilt, maybe internalizing what everyone else was telling her. Why are you being negative? Why are you being a downer? All because we had complete faith in the medical field. And then her hands started to not work, and her voice started to slur. And finally, she got referred back to a neurologist for another look at it. And this time, of course, they saw more nerve damage in the second EMG in more places, and they diagnosed her with ALS. I always remember, I kind of knew she had a neurology appointment. And of course, in the lead up to it, it's like such a delicate balance, like, I hope you get the answers you need. I think I knew that she had ALS at that point because she had been progressing. But I also didn't want to diagnose her or focus on something that maybe would be very hard to hear. So, I was just trying, well, I want to know what happens. I hope it gives you the answers you're looking for. And she called me after it. And I was driving on a stretch of I-80 by the Bay Bridge that is notoriously poor reception. But I knew I couldn't tell her, like, let me call you back. So I, was like, okay, what happened at the neurologist? And she said, I got diagnosed with ALS. And she said in the saddest voice that I've ever heard, such a, I can't describe the tone. But she said, all I can think about is my mother in a lift over a commode at the breakfast table of my parents' house, while my father wiped drool from her mouth and said, oh, look, she's smiling. I don't want that to happen to me. And I had nothing to say to her. I couldn't say that wouldn't happen to her. Yeah. And it dawned on me that was probably the image in her mind all these decades, was seeing her strong, reserved, dignified mother be in this position of indignity, or perception of indignity and dependence. And that horrified her. And that was probably what she was thinking about when she was expressing anxiety about developing ALS. And she didn't want to bring it up until she finally got diagnosed. And on some level, that might have felt a release. Like, I can now share with you the horror that I've been living with, because now it's official.
Jean's mother progressed quickly after her diagnosis, passing away in 2019. After her death, Jean decided to honor her legacy by participating in a study for people with family histories of ALS.
When she was at Columbia and they found out they had C9, my siblings who had been with her for that appointment noted that Columbia was recruiting family members of genetic ALS patients to participate in research to see what's going on before the disease happens. And, I didn't want to really engage while my mom was sick, but after she passed, I decided to contact them and go into their study. I felt very proud about it. My mom was a very civic person, engaged in a lot of effort. She worked at the New Rochelle Public Library as the head of the children's room for many, many years. Was a librarian for 40 years. Her funeral, her wake and funeral, like, over 200 people came. Local politicians, all these people she touched from the library. She also lived in the same city her whole life, basically. So she had deep connections to the community. So I thought I was really honoring her commitment to civic participation by becoming a research subject. I decided not to find out my gene status in the first meeting, because I was like, my mom just died, and I'm probably not in a good place to make a decision like that. But I kind of knew I wanted to know. And I had the knowledge of my mother's intense anxiety for decades without genetic testing. So I knew that you could still be quite anxious without genetic testing. There's this canard in the discourse that getting genetic testing to confirm you have the gene or not will make people nervous wrecks. And I already knew that really it's the knowledge that you're at risk, which would trigger that, not necessarily the final narrowing down whether you actually have the gene or not. And I realized I assumed I had it because I felt I took after my mom, and I knew then, and I know that now, that that's not very rational. It is very random. It's 50-50, and you could, each gene is random, which one you get from your parents. So, but I felt like I took after her. So I assumed I had it, and 9 months later, I went back for a second visit and did choose for the genetic testing and discovered I carried the mutation. And to be honest, I don't feel like it totally rocked my world or anything like that, because I had assumed that I carried it prior to finding out. And I do think that that's a very good defense mechanism for anyone. And, when I encounter people online who are talking about this and they're saying things like, oh, I hope, I pray I don't have it. I mentioned, that might be a hard mindset if you are positive. If you've been really putting all your bets on you're going to be negative and it's positive, that's not a nice thing to do to yourself. So after that, I started poking around in the online information about ALS. I saw that there were Facebook groups for genetic ALS and C9, and I overcame some fears of genetic discrimination. So I got on these Facebook groups, and I had noticed when I researched a bit about this that there was nothing on the internet pointing towards people in our position. Everything was, if they mentioned this at all, was assuring people not in our position how rare our position was, and that they didn't need to worry about it. And I thought that was strange. It didn't seem right. And it did seem like there was a lack of voice for people in our position.
Despite the lack of information on her situation online, Jean was able to connect through social media with other asymptomatic carriers. She found a growing community and others who, like her, could see that the status quo needed to change.
So I finally worked up the courage to go into these Facebook groups, and I had an understanding that there was something not quite right with how our community was being represented or addressed, And soon after I joined, Daniel Barvin made a post in the Facebook group that said, hey guys, check out this Huntington's Disease Youth Organization website. Look at it. It's amazing. Why don't we have anything like that? We should try to do something like this. And as this was, and Huntington's Disease Youth Organization is a well-established nonprofit that speaks and serves the pre-symptomatic Huntington's disease community. And, this dovetailed with what I was thinking already. So I was like, yeah, let's do it. And a number of other people signed up in this thread and said, yes, let's go, let's do it. I think we had a meeting or two, just brainstorming some more. Around that time, Nadia Sethi, who you know so well, Dr. Sethi, said, hey, IMALS does these volunteer teams. You guys could hook up with IMALS. And we decided to do that. That was August 2020. When we first started as a group, definitely our thoughts were geared towards creating content, making content available, addressed to our community, and education for our community. These were things that we were thinking about. But as we started speaking to some people in the field, it became clear that there were much more serious issues happening. We started meeting as a group, right? We started talking to some people in the field, and I started to realize that there were some things really troubling with what was happening. For instance, in 2020, a group of ALS experts got together to talk about diagnostic standards for ALS. And it was called the gold, and they came up with a set of recommendations for what an ALS diagnosis should be. And they called it the Gold Coast criteria. I had found online the ALS-Related revised criteria diagnostic standard for ALS from 2015. And I was pleased to see common sense was reflected in this 2015 document that said if you had an ALS mutation, you could have a lower bar of symptoms to be diagnosed. The 2020 Gold Coast criteria got rid of that and raised the bar for genetic mutation carriers. We connected with the wonderful Dr. Amar Al-Chalabi, who I so appreciate. He's very open and very communicative, and actually has been a big ally in the things that I've been trying to promulgate to the field. But we didn't know each other that well then. He agreed to come talk to our group, and I asked him, I was like, what was the discussion? There must have been a big debate to raise the diagnostic bar for genetic mutation carriers. I can't imagine the drama that there must have been, just a huge back and forth, and I assume you had good reasons for doing this. And he told me it wasn't discussed. And I was like, I saw that there were people from these ALS associations and stuff in the room. So there were patient advocates in the room, and the patient advocates didn't make you talk about it. And he was like, no. And that was like a light bulb moment for me. Like, wow, we need to be at the table. Our community needs a seat at the table. And I'm not saying what the answer should have been, but it should have been discussed and debated. So that was very troubling.
In addition to lobbying for better representation for asymptomatic carriers, Jean also began looking at the available data herself and made findings that would eventually be presented at prestigious ALS research conferences.
I also started realizing, that, people acted like the genetic ALS community was a bit of a mystery. We don't know how many of these people are walking around. And I realized that using some simple calculations, you could arrive at a rough estimate for how many people there are with these mutations. Taking the prevalence of the mutation in the disease, which for C9 is both ALS and FTD. So let's just say it's 10% for both, which is around what it is. But if it's 10% for both of the diseases, you can see the incidence for the disease each year. How many cases are being diagnosed of the ALS each year? How many cases are being diagnosed for FTD each year? And then taking that 10% of each, you can find the incidence of C9orf72 ALS and C9orf72 FTD. Further, hard work of scientists has arrived at an average age of onset for C9 disease, and they've arrived. It's 58. So there's this number. It came up to about 2,000 in the U.S. 2,000 cases of ALS or FTD from C9 carriers each year. So these 2,000 people keep reappearing each year. Different people obviously, but these 2,000 cases keep showing up, and assuming that the incidence numbers and prevalence numbers are holding true, which for a genetic disease you would kind of assume. If we have the average age of onset we can times that by the annual incidence, and you can get a rough estimate for how many people there are, because these people need to come from somewhere. So doing that, you arrive at like 125,000 C9 carriers in the US. Now there's the issue of penetrance. The only peer-reviewed published estimate is 100% with a note that, oh, it's probably 90%. Dr. Al-Chalabi did a preprint that came out in 2021 using a much more rigorous calculation that arrived at an overall 90% penetrance for C9 with ALS and FTD. Other people have said out some other things. It's certainly not firmly established. But assuming a 90% penetrance, meaning 10% of C9 carriers live to old age without expressing disease, then the number of asymptomatic carriers rises to like 140,000 in the US. So ALS and FTD are devastating diseases. If a cure for ALS or FTD were to appear before us, there would be compelling reason to give it to that entire asymptomatic population, which is like 5 times as many people with an ALS diagnosis are living at any time. And so, like, people have not been thinking about it this way, and it doesn't, doesn't really make sense. So actually, I just kind of threw this out there on Twitter, like, hey, you could do this. And Dr. Al-Chalabi encouraged me to present it as a poster at the ALS-MND symposium. So he accepted my poster proposal. The abstract got published in the ALS-FTD journal, and I was able to present it at the ALS-MND symposium virtually. Around the same time, we decided to do a survey of our community about their desire for pre-symptomatic treatment. We got 174 eligible responses, and overwhelmingly people were like, yeah, we want pre-symptomatic treatment. And people said they were willing to hazard risks to get it. So rather than, people guessing at what appropriate risk would be for people to access pre-symptomatic treatment, we're trying to say, hey, listen to the patients about what risk they want to take, and include our viewpoints in what care we want. So that was cool. We presented the poster at the ALS-MND Alliance Allied Professional Forum in December. Also last year, I saw that the NIH ALS strategic plan was getting publicized by the NIH. And it said community stakeholders were people diagnosed with ALS and caregivers. And I immediately emailed them and said, hey, you're missing that there's these hundreds of thousands of people at great risk of genetic ALS. And to their credit, they immediately updated their, verbiage on who the stakeholders were and added ALS gene carriers to it.
Jean's advocacy efforts have brought her to other important conferences and meetings. She served on the committee for the National Institute of Health's ALS strategic plan after campaigning for representation for asymptomatic carriers. There, she was able to successfully lobby to add language to the plan about early interventions for people with ALS-related genetic mutations. She also met a key collaborator who would help her organize her group of advocates as a nonprofit.
Dr. Terry Hyman Patterson let me know, who is my co-chair on the Quality of Life Working Group, let me know that, she was appreciated the things that I was talking about, and that we could work with her nonprofit, the ALS Hope Foundation. So, she could, sponsor us as a nonprofit under their 501c3. So, and of course, offering her mentorship as a leading expert in the field. So we as the team, who had just been an informal volunteer team, unanimously decided to do that. And we named ourselves and Genetic ALS and FTD and the Legacy. And we've been slowly ramping up our activities since January. We aim to provide support to people in our position, because I don't want anyone to have to deal with this like my mom did, having no support while they struggle with this. We aim to educate, and we've been having webinars. We had Dr. Aaron Bittler present a few days ago, Dr. Matt Disney a few weeks before that. And we are continuing to have speakers who touch on our issues come and do webinars for us. We aim to support research. Currently on our website, we have the 2 poster presentations that we recently presented. And we also have a list of genetic ALS studies. So people can see where they can go if they want to be in longitudinal ALS research. In addition to recruiting people for other studies, we are interested in continuing to look at other ways that we can lead our own research as people impacted. Working on some ideas for that right now. And big picture vision, we'd love to look at having some kind of family tree depository, something like that, but that's certainly in the planning stages, far away from implementation. And finally, and I think most importantly, we need to be advocates for our community. We held a patient listening session with the FDA in January, where we had over 40 FDA staff attend. We shared stories of 8 genetic ALS impacted people, including those impacted by C9orf72, SOD1, progranulin, TARDP. So we had a wide variety of experiences, FTD, ALS, and I think it was a strong presentation, and the feedback from the FDA was wonderful. So we're always looking to get our viewpoints represented when discussions about our care are happening. Yeah, we're just continuing to try to get more things for our community and a shot at beating these diseases, because it's just common sense that the best time to treat neurodegeneration is as early as possible. And yet this has not been the strategy in ALS or FTD, despite ALS having multiple disease-modifying medications. So there's a real tension there that we need to help untangle. I will say we are pleased that our mentor and supporter, Dr. Terry Hyman Patterson, is working on something for her and other ALS experts to begin thinking about this stuff, and we appreciate that. But I don't think we can go back to a time where our views are not being heard.
To learn more about Jean's work and get involved in her mission, you can visit the ALS Hope Foundation at alshf.org, or you can reach out to geneticaLSFTD@gmail.com. There are currently no treatments to stop or reverse ALS, but the ALS Therapy Development Institute is working to change that. To learn more about ALS TDI and our research to end ALS, visit als.net. Thanks for listening.